There is a country in the middle of Europe that touches no ocean at all. No coastline, no harbor, no port has ever been built on its soil because the sea is hundreds of kilometers away in every direction. And yet almost everything this country is famous for is water. Waterfalls falling out of hanging valleys, lakes so clear they look artificial, glaciers holding enough frozen water to supply a continent, rivers that begin here and end in 4 different seas. This is Switzerland, 41,000 square kilometers, most of it standing on end, a nation squeezed between France, Germany, Italy, and Austria that somehow never became any of them. Most visitors arrive with a list already written for them. Chocolate, watches, banks, neutrality, trains that leave on the minute they say they will. All of that is true. None of it explains the place. Because underneath the postcard version of Switzerland is a much stranger story. A landlocked country in the highest mountains in Europe that decided roughly 700 years ago to govern itself when nobody else in the region was doing anything of the kind. A nation of farmers and herders who fought off empires, then spent the next 6 centuries drilling holes through the very mountains that had protected them. They built railways up cliffs that goats struggle to climb. They hung suspension bridges between summits. They dammed valleys to power a country with no oil and no coal of its own. And at the highest point of it all, they built a train station above the clouds, 3.5 kilometers in the sky, with a telescope pointed at the stars. This is a journey through that country, through the ice that built it, the mountains that isolated it, the engineering that connected it anyway, and the handful of small, stubborn cantons that gave the whole nation its name. It begins in a valley so narrow that the sun sometimes takes until midday to reach the valley floor. Drive south from Interlaken and the road narrows. The peaks close in on either side and the valley floor drops away into something that looks less like a landscape than a set built for one. This is Lauterbrunnen. The valley was carved during the last ice age. A glacier, hundreds of meters thick, ground its way down through the bedrock for tens of thousands of years, and when it finally retreated, it left behind a trough with walls that fall away almost straight down. Geologists call this shape a glacial trough. Most people just call it impossible the first time they see it. Along those walls, water pours off the cliff edges in ribbons. There are more than 70 waterfalls in this one valley, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above, and in the height of spring, some of them run so heavy, the spray drifts across the entire valley floor like weather. The village itself sits at the base of all this, sloped roofs and flower boxes, and a church built plainly enough that it does not try to compete with what is above it. The Lucerne River threads through the middle of the valley, gathers the meltwater falling from every side, and carries it north toward Interlaken, and the 2 lakes beyond. Climb the valley wall, and the world changes completely. above Lauterbrunnen sits Wengen, reached only by a cogwheel railway because the road never made it up here. A little further along the ridge is Mürren, higher again, with nothing below it but air and the whole valley laid out like a map. Neither village allows private cars. Both were, for a long time, farming communities that happened to sit on some of the best views in the Alps and only became resorts once the railways made them reachable. And above all of it, three names that anyone who has read a book about mountaineering will recognize: the Eiger, the Mönch, the Jungfrau, the Ogre, the Monk, and the Maiden, standing in a row. The Eiger's north face so notoriously difficult that it killed climber after climber through the 1930s before it was finally beaten. Beneath the valley, there is one more waterfall, and it is the strangest of them all because you cannot see it from outside. Under the mountain, follow the valley floor south from the village, and a footpath leads to an opening cut into the rock, barely wide enough for a doorway. Walk in, and the sound changes first, then the light. This is Trümmelbach, and it is not a waterfall beside a mountain. It is a waterfall inside one. Meltwater from the glaciers above the valley, including the ice fields feeding the Eigerrand, the Jungfrau, does not fall over the cliff face like the other waterfalls in the valley. It found a crack in the limestone long ago and carved its way straight through the rock instead. And over thousands of years, that crack widened into a series of chambers. 10 separate waterfalls now run inside this one mountain, one after another, connected by tunnels and lift shafts blasted through the stone, so visitors can follow the water down. It is, by some estimates, the only glacier waterfall system of its kind accessible inside Europe. Stand in one of the lower chambers, and the noise is enormous. Water thundering through a gap in the rock that daylight never really reaches, and it is worth remembering what is actually happening here. This is glacial ice, months or years old, finally reaching the sea. It just has a very long way still to go. Follow that water back out of the mountain, up past the valley walls, and it leads somewhere the trains cannot easily reach. Somewhere the whole country was, in a sense, built to survive. Into the ice. At the head of a neighboring valley, a railway does something that should not really be possible. It begins at Kleine Scheidegg, a mountain pass and rail junction sitting in the shadow of the Eiger, already well above the tree line. From there, a line climbs higher still, and for the last stretch, it disappears entirely into the mountain, tunneled straight through solid rock beneath the Eiger and the Mönch. Construction began in 1896. It took 16 years, much of it hand-dug through granite in conditions that killed several of the workers involved. And when it finally opened in 1912, it delivered passengers to the highest railway station in Europe. Jungfraujoch, 3,500 meters above sea level. Step out at the top, and the air is noticeably thinner, the light sharper, and the landscape has become entirely ice. This saddle sits at the very edge of the Alps Glacier, the largest single body of ice anywhere in the Alps, holding something in the order of 10 billion tons of frozen water. It is fed continuously by snowfall from the surrounding peaks, compacting year after year into ice that, at its center, is hundreds of meters thick. On warmer days, the surface begins to run. Meltwater gathers into streams across the top of the glacier, and where it finds a weakness, it drills straight down through the ice, boring narrow, near-vertical shafts called moulins that can reach all the way to the bedrock beneath. Fall into one, and you understand instantly why guides never let visitors wander the ice alone. At the summit station, there is a domed observatory built for astronomers rather than skiers, taking advantage of the thin, still, unpolluted air this high above the valley floor. It is a strange thing to find at the end of a century-old railway tunnel, a research station, watching the sky, sitting directly on top of Europe's largest reservoir of fresh water. That reservoir is shrinking. The Alech has lost a significant portion of its length within living memory, and glaciologists monitor it as one of the clearest single indicators of how quickly the Alps are warming. The ice that built this entire landscape, that carved Lauterbrunnen and every valley like it, is now retreating faster than at almost any point since the last ice age ended. Which makes it worth asking a question this country has spent 700 years answering in its own way. What do you do when the ground beneath you refuses to stay still, and every neighbor around you is bigger and stronger than you are? You go down from the ice into the valleys where people actually live, and there, in a handful of small communities on the shore of a lake, the answer to that question was written down in 1291, where the country was born. The lake is called Vierwaldstättersee in German, Lake Lucerne to most of the outside world. And it does not look, at first glance, like the site of a revolution. It is a long, folded body of water, bent into several distinct arms by the mountains crowding around it, so that from any single viewpoint, you can never quite see the whole thing at once. Steep forested slopes drop straight into the water. Small towns sit at the edges, where the land finally levels out enough to build on. 3 of those communities gave the whole country its name: Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden. In the summer of 1291, representatives of these 3 valley communities met and drew up a charter. It survives today, a single sheet of parchment, and in it, the 3 communities pledged to support one another against any outside power that threatened their traditional rights and their existing local courts. It did not create a nation in any modern sense. It was closer to a mutual defense pact between 3 small mountain communities who had watched the Habsburg dynasty tightening its grip on the region and did not like what they saw coming. But it is treated now as the founding document of the Swiss Confederation. The canton of Schwyz gave the whole country its name in German, Schweiz, and its flag, a white cross on red, eventually became the flag of Switzerland itself. Meadow, where the Pact is traditionally said to have been sworn, sits on the lakeshore, reachable only by boat or on foot, a plain green field with no monument competing for attention. It is called the Rütli, and it remains one of the most quietly significant patches of grass in Europe. Out of that same period grew a legend that has done more to shape how Switzerland sees itself than almost any verified historical event: the Archer. In the town of Bern, on the eastern side of Lake Lucerne, a museum stands on the spot local tradition names as the birthplace of a man who may never have existed at all: William Tell. The story, as it eventually settled into its familiar shape, an Austrian governor set his hat on a pole in the town's square and demanded that everyone passing bow to it. Tell refused. As punishment, he was forced to shoot an apple from his own son's head with a crossbow at a distance in front of a crowd. He succeeded. Then, when the governor asked why he had a second bolt tucked into his coat, Tell answered that it had been meant for the governor's heart. Had the first shot killed his son, he was arrested anyway. He escaped. And in the versions of the story, shaped by later centuries, his defiance becomes the spark for the wider uprising against Habsburg rule. Historians have combed the archives for a real William Tell for a very long time and found nothing. The earliest written versions of the story only appear more than a century after the events they claim to describe, and the apple shot from a head motif turns up in the folklore of several other Northern European cultures, suggesting the tale may have simply attached itself to Switzerland rather than originating there. None of that has weakened its grip. The story was written into a play by Friedrich Schiller, turned into an opera by Rossini, and became, over the 19th century, the single most useful piece of national mythology a young country trying to explain itself to the world could ask for. A single, ordinary man refusing to bow was easier to put on a stamp than a 13th century property dispute. And in a real battle, a few decades after the charter was signed, the story of defiance against a much larger power had something concrete to point to. Because in November 1315, in a narrow pass near a lake called Egeri, the small confederation of mountain cantons met a Habsburg army in the field and won. Morgarten and the Meadow Republic. The pass at Morgarten is unremarkable to look at now. A road, some farmland, a lake pressed close against a wooded hillside. That geography was the entire battle plan. The Habsburg force that marched toward Schwyz in 1315 was a heavily armored cavalry army, exactly the kind of force that dominated open battlefields across medieval Europe. The Confederates had no cavalry to match it, and no interest in fighting on open ground where that mismatch would matter. Instead, they let the Austrian column funnel into the narrow track between the lake and the hillside, where the armored horsemen had almost no room to maneuver, and then attacked from above, with halberds long enough to drag riders from their saddles. It was, by any measure, a rout. And it confirmed something the founding cantons had only hoped was true 3 decades earlier, that a confederation of farmers in the right terrain could defeat professional feudal armies. More cantons joined in the decades that followed. More battles were fought and won, most famously at Meadow in 1476, where the Swiss broke the army of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, so completely that it effectively ended Burgundian power in the region. By the early 16th century, Swiss mercenary infantry had become the most feared soldiers in Europe, hired out to fight other people's wars because the terrain that produced them had not produced much of an economy to keep them home. What grew out of all this fighting was not, at first, anything like a modern state. It was a loose alliance of self-governing valleys, each fiercely protective of its own local traditions. And nowhere is that older form of politics more visible today than in the canton that gave the country its name. In Glarus, once a year, the citizens still gather outdoors in the town square and vote by raising their hands. No ballot box, no secret vote. Just a crowd, in the open air, deciding its own laws in view of each other in a tradition called the Landsgemeinde that stretches back centuries. It is direct democracy in something close to its oldest surviving form, still practiced in a handful of small Swiss cantons, long after most of the world moved to a ballot and an envelope. That instinct, small units governing themselves and only reluctantly ceding power upward, still shapes the country's federal structure today. Switzerland has 26 cantons, and each one guards its independence the way the original three guarded theirs in 1291. Down from those mountain battlefields, on the shore of the same lake where the Pact was sworn, a city grew up around a bridge, and it became one of the most photographed towns in Europe. The city on the bridge Lucerne sits where the Rhône River leaves the lake, and for most of its history, that single fact decided everything about the place. The river needed crossing. So in the 1200s, the town built a covered wooden bridge, angled across the water, its interior painted centuries later with scenes from the city's history and from the lives of its patron saints. The Kapellbrücke, the Chapel Bridge, is the oldest surviving covered wooden bridge in Europe. And even after a fire in 1993 destroyed a large section of it and most of its paintings, the town rebuilt it exactly as it was, because by then, the bridge was not simply a crossing, it was the town's memory of itself. Medieval towers still stand along the old city walls above the rooftops. Frescoed building facades line the squares below, and the whole town sits framed by two mountains that between them tell you something about how Switzerland has always related to its own landscape. Above the southern shore rises Mount Pilatus, and for centuries the mountain carried a genuinely dangerous reputation. Medieval legend held that the body of Pontius Pilate had been thrown into a small lake near the summit after his death, and that disturbing those waters would summon storms. Climbing the mountain was, for a long stretch of the Middle Ages, actively forbidden by local authorities, on the belief that it would provoke the spirit trapped there. It was not formally climbed by permission, until the 1500s, and only then did the superstition begin to fade. Across the lake stands Rigi, treated with none of that suspicion at all. In the 19th century, a cogwheel railway was built up its slopes, one of the very first mountain railways anywhere in the world, and Rigi became known across Europe simply as the Queen of the Mountains, a place where composers and aristocrats traveled specifically to watch the sunrise from the summit. One mountain, feared for centuries as cursed ground, the other climbed by rail so tourists could watch the dawn in comfort, both visible from the same waterfront in Lucerne. That contradiction, reverence for the wild, alongside an enthusiasm for engineering straight through it, turns out to be close to the defining trait of the whole country. Nowhere is that trait more visible than in the mountain passes that connect Switzerland's isolated valleys to everywhere else. And to understand what that isolation used to mean, you have to go up into the passes themselves. The roads that should not exist. For most of Swiss history, the Alps were not a backdrop, they were a wall. Valleys just a few kilometers apart, as the crow flies, might as well have belonged to different countries, separated by ridgelines that snow closed for half the year. Trade, when it happened at all, moved on mule tracks across a small number of passes, guarded jealously by whichever community controlled them, because a pass meant income, and income meant power. The Gotthard was the most important of these, a route straight through the center of the Massif, linking German-speaking Switzerland to Italy, used since the Roman period and fought over for most of the centuries after. The Grimsel Pass, further west, connected the Bernese Alps to the Valais, a trade and communication route in use since antiquity, its high plateau dotted today with glacial lakes and hydroelectric dams. The Simplon, further south again, was little more than a mule track until Napoleon, needing a reliable military road between France and his territories in Italy, ordered it rebuilt in 1801. A statue of the imperial eagle still marks the pass, commemorating an emperor who wanted the Alps to stop being an obstacle to his ambitions. What actually broke the isolation, though, was not roads, it was rail, and the engineering it demanded was, by the standards of its time, close to unbelievable. In the Graubünden Mountains, above the Landwasser River, engineers in 1901 faced a canyon their planned railway line needed to cross. They built a curved stone viaduct across it, 6 arches high, and the final section that meets the tunnel mouth on the far cliff face was constructed without any scaffolding reaching the ground below. The two halves of the structure were built out from either side and met precisely in mid-air above the gorge. It has carried trains for well over a century since, without a major rebuild. Further south, near the village of Bruzio, a different problem produced a stranger solution. The railway needed to descend a steep slope without the expense of tunnels or a cogwheel system, so the engineers simply let the track spiral. The Bruzio line curves through a full loop, crossing back over itself on a viaduct, losing height gradually enough for an ordinary train to manage the grade. Seen from above, it looks less like a railway than a piece of abstract sculpture laid across a hillside for no reason anyone could guess, without already knowing what it was for. These lines, and the dozens like them, threading through the Alps, turned Switzerland's greatest weakness, a landscape that made travel between its own regions genuinely difficult, into one of its most distinctive exports. Alpine tourism did not grow up despite the mountains. It grew up because the railways had finally made the mountains reachable. And by the late 1800s, hotels were opening in villages that a generation earlier had been reachable only on foot or by mule. South of the passes, past the highest tunnels, the mountains open onto something that looks and feels like an entirely different country. Switzerland's Italy. Cross the Gotthard, heading south, and the change is almost immediate. The architecture softens. The roof tiles turn to stone instead of wood. Palm trees appear in gardens, where, a valley away, nothing but conifer would survive the winter. This is Ticino, the Italian-speaking canton, and its climate is genuinely its own. Sheltered from the worst of the Alpine winter by the mountains to its north, and warmed by its proximity to the lakes it shares with Italy, Ticino supports Mediterranean vegetation at latitudes where the rest of Switzerland is still buried in snow. Lugano sits on the shore of its own lake, a town of steep hillside streets and Renaissance-era architecture, its cultural life shaped for centuries by its closeness to Lombardy. Swiss architects who trained in Italy carried Italian design sensibilities back across the border with them, and the churches and palazzi of the old town reflect it. On the hillside, above the lake, sits Gandria, a village so tightly stacked into the slope that its stone stairways and covered passages barely leave room for two people to pass. Its houses built directly at the water's edge, for a town that spent centuries as a stopping point for travelers moving between Switzerland and Italy. Inland Bellinzona guards the valley, leading up to the Gotthard Pass with three separate medieval castles, each on its own hilltop, built to control what was, for centuries, the single most important trade corridor through the Central Alps. Castelgrande, the oldest and largest, dominates the town from a rocky outcrop. Montebello sits a little higher, with its defensive walls still largely intact, and Sasso Corbaro, smallest and highest of the three, watches the approach from above them both. Together, the three castles form one of the more complete, surviving examples of medieval Alpine fortification anywhere in Europe. West of Bellinzona, the valleys narrow and the villages grow quieter. In the Val Verzasca, a river runs an almost unreal shade of emerald green, cutting through smooth rock channels on its way down from the mountains, and the village of Lavatezzo is built around a humpbacked stone bridge, rebuilt after a flood tore through the valley in 1868, that arches so steeply over the water, it has become one of the most photographed bridges in the country. Further north still, the Val Bavona holds some of the most isolated villages left in Ticino. In Foroglio, a waterfall drops directly beside the cluster of stone houses, close enough that its sound never really leaves the village. Slate, quarried locally, covers every roof, chosen centuries ago because it could survive winters that would tear ordinary tiles apart. This entire canton, in other words, is Switzerland's answer to a question most Alpine countries never have to ask. What do you do with a valley that gets more sun than it should? Ticino's answer was to grow grapes, plant palms, and let the architecture drift south toward Italy, while remaining stubbornly Swiss. North and east of Ticino, in the canton of Graubünden, the answer to isolation went the other way entirely. Rather than softening, the landscape there stayed as wild as anywhere in the Alps, and the country made a decision in 1914 to keep a piece of it that way forever. The Wild Corner. Graubünden is the largest canton in Switzerland and, by most measures, the emptiest. Its valleys run in every direction, cut off from one another by ridgelines high enough to hold snow through most of the year, and its population has always been thin on the ground compared to almost anywhere else in the country. In the middle of it sits the Swiss National Park, founded on the 1st of August, 1914, the same week the First World War began in the rest of Europe. It was the first national park established anywhere in the Alps, and one of the earliest in all of Europe, and the philosophy behind it was unusually strict for its time. Nothing would be managed. No hunting, no logging, no grazing, no paths beyond the ones needed for visitors to walk through without disturbing anything. The land would simply be left alone, and whatever happened to it would be entirely its own doing. And more than a century later, that policy has produced something rare, a landscape with visibly minimal human interference, in the middle of one of the most densely engineered mountain ranges on Earth. Chamois move across the rock faces, here with an agility that looks almost impossible. Hooves adapted over millions of years of evolution to grip stone and ice with a precision no rubber sole has ever matched, choosing the steepest, least accessible terrain specifically because it keeps them safe from wolves and eagles. East of the park, the Engadine Valley holds a chain of lakes strung together by the young Inn River, ringed by larch forest that turns gold in autumn and framed by peaks that keep their snow for most of the year. Villages like Sils, Maria, and Maloja sit on the shores, quiet even in summer, and it was here, walking the shoreline of Lake Sils in the 1880s, that the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche found the ideas that would become part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He returned to this valley for years, drawn back by a landscape he found nowhere else. It is worth pausing on what these two places, sitting almost next to each other on the map, actually represent. A national park designed around the principle of leaving nature entirely alone. And a valley that, for one of the most influential philosophers of the modern era, offered exactly the kind of solitude a mind needs to think its way somewhere new. Graubünden kept its wildness. Follow its rivers and rail lines west, though toward the lake that borders France, and Switzerland shows an entirely different side of itself, cosmopolitan, diplomatic, and built almost entirely around water of a gentler kind. The lake that faces France, Lake Geneva, curves in a long crescent between the Alps and the Jura Mountains, and along its northern shore, the hillside has been carved for the better part of 1,000 years into some of the most valuable farmland in the country. This is Lavaux. Terraced vineyards climb the slope in tight, stacked rows from the water's edge almost to the tree line, and the earliest plantings here trace back to the Roman period. But the terraces visible today, the stone retaining walls that make farming this steep, an angle possible at all, were largely built by Christian monks during the Middle Ages. Generation after generation, moving stone by hand to hold soil on a slope that gravity would otherwise have stripped bare within a few winters. The dominant grape is Chasselas, a white variety that thrives on the reflected heat. The lake throws back up the terraces, producing wine that rarely leaves the region because there is rarely enough of it to export. Follow the shoreline east, and the towns grow steadily more famous. Vevey, where Charlie Chaplin spent the final decades of his life after leaving the United States. Drawn, like Byron and Rousseau and Victor Hugo before him, to a lake that seems to have specialized for centuries in making writers and artists feel at home. Montreux, a little further along, framed by the Alps rising directly behind it, and blessed with close to 2,000 hours of sunshine a year, an unusually generous number for anywhere this far into the mountains. Just offshore from Montreux, on a small rock island barely separated from the mainland, stands Chillon Castle. Lord Byron visited in 1816, and the story he heard there of a monk imprisoned in the castle's lower dungeon for years became the basis of his poem, The Prisoner of Chillon. The poem made the castle famous across Europe long before most of its visitors had ever seen it. And today, the pillar, the prisoner, is said to have been chained to still carries carved initials. Byron's, supposedly among them, scratched into the stone by 19th century visitors who wanted proof they had stood exactly where the poem was set. At the western tip of the lake sits Geneva, and here the story of this small country stops being local at all. The city that belongs to everyone. Geneva was founded by the Romans, grew into a trading center through the Middle Ages, and by the 16th century had become one of the intellectual centers of the Protestant Reformation. None of that, on its own, explains why the city later became something closer to a second capital for the entire planet. That happened after the First World War, when the newly formed League of Nations chose Geneva as its headquarters. The League collapsed within a generation, but the habit it started did not. The United Nations built its European headquarters here. So did the World Health Organization and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Founded in this city in the 1860s by a Swiss businessman, horrified by what he had witnessed on a European battlefield. Geneva became, almost by accident, and then very deliberately, the city where the world's disputes are negotiated rather than fought. Along the harbor, a fountain called the Jet d'eau throws a column of water more than 140 meters into the air, visible from almost anywhere in the city. Originally built as a simple pressure release valve for a hydraulic power network in the 1880s and kept ever since, because the city discovered it simply liked having it there. And at the point where two rivers meet on the western edge of the city, something quietly strange happens in the water itself. The Rhône, flowing out of the lake, runs a pale glacial turquoise, carrying fine sediment ground down by ice further upstream. The Arve, arriving from glaciers on the French side of Mont Blanc, runs a darker, muddier color entirely. Where the two rivers join, at a spot called La Jonction, the two currents run alongside each other for a visible stretch before finally mixing, a hard line drawn straight down the middle of the water, 2 glaciers worth of meltwater refusing for a little while to blend. Geneva also became, almost as a side effect of being wealthy, well-connected and full of skilled craftsmen, one of the birthplaces of the modern watch industry. Several of the world's most recognized watchmaking houses trace their founders back to this city, part of a broader Swiss obsession with precision timekeeping that would eventually give the whole country its reputation for punctuality, north and east from the lake. That same obsession with precision shows up in a very different form, in the cities where Switzerland keeps its money and, in one case, changed physics forever. The capital that almost wasn't. Bern was never supposed to be the country's capital in any grand, planned sense. It became one largely because the larger cantons could not agree on any of the obvious candidates, and Bern was central, neutral enough, and willing. Legend holds that the city's founder, hunting in the forests along the river, named the settlement after the first animal he killed there, a bear. Bears still appear on the city's coat of arms, and for centuries, live bears were kept in a pit near the old town, specifically because the legend demanded it. The Aare River loops around the historic center in a tight bend, nearly encircling it, and in summer, Bernese locals do something that looks alarming to almost everyone else. They jump into the current upstream of the old town and let the river carry them past it, climbing out downstream, using their own capital city's river as a lazy river ride. The old town itself, arcaded streets lined with sandstone buildings, has changed remarkably little in shape since the Middle Ages, and its central clock tower still puts on a small, mechanical performance every hour. Figures rotating out from inside the clockwork, to the sound of chimes that have marked the hour here for centuries. It was in Bern, working a day job at the patent office rather than in any university laboratory, that a young clerk named Albert Einstein wrote the papers in 1905 that would eventually upend physics. He was not yet famous. He was simply a civil servant with a gift for thinking clearly about light, time, and motion in a quiet federal capital that had no idea what it was housing. An hour or so north, two cities do for Switzerland's economy what Bern does for its politics. Money and medicine. Zurich is the largest city in the country by a wide margin, and its skyline reflects what it does for a living. This is where Swiss banking concentrated itself through the 20th century, and the financial institutions, headquartered along its central avenues, still manage a share of global wealth, wildly out of proportion to the country's size. The Limmat River runs straight through the middle of the old town, flowing out of Lake Zurich, and the city has operated an extensive tram network continuously for more than 130 years, quietly making Zurich one of the oldest and most reliable public transit systems anywhere in Europe. Basel, further north, where the country's border meets both France and Germany at once, took a different path entirely. In 1460, it became home to Switzerland's first university, and the scholarly reputation that followed drew figures like Erasmus of Rotterdam to live and work here. By the late 19th century, that academic foundation had helped turn Basel into one of the world's centers for the pharmaceutical industry. Several of the sector's largest companies still headquartered along the Rhine that splits the city in two. It also holds, by most counts, the highest concentration of museums of any city in the country, a claim to being Switzerland's cultural capital that Zurich, despite its size, has never quite managed to take away from it. Between these two economic centers and the mountains that built the nation's identity lie dozens of smaller towns that, individually, would each anchor a whole chapter of European history somewhere else. Together, in Switzerland, they are simply the background. The small towns nobody photographs. Enough. Stein am Rhein grew up around a monastery founded in the year 1007. Its old town, now lined with half-timbered houses, painted with murals, so detailed and so well preserved that art historians treat the town itself as a kind of open-air gallery. One of the most complete surviving examples of a medieval Rhine trading town anywhere on the river. In the canton of Fribourg, the town of Gruyères gave its name to one of the most exported cheeses on the planet, a name that, according to local legend, traces back to a nobleman called Gruerius, who once caught a crane and adopted it as the town's emblem. Its 13th century fortress still looks down over the same rolling dairy country that has been producing that cheese for the better part of 1,000 years. In the Far East, Poschiavo sits close enough to the Italian border that its language, food, and architecture blend both cultures into something that belongs fully to neither. Nearby, the railway line drops down through the Brusio spiral toward the Italian lowlands. One last piece of the same engineering obsession that built the Landwasser Viaduct and the tunnels beneath the Eiger. Every one of these towns, in its own small way, tells the same story the whole country tells at scale, isolated by geography, forced to become self-sufficient because no one else was reliably coming to help, and, eventually, connected to everything else anyway, because Switzerland decided early on that isolation was a starting condition, to be engineered around, not a fate to be accepted. Which leaves one place left to visit, not a city, not a village, the place where all of this, the rivers, the lakes, the waterfalls, the engineering, actually begins. The Water Tower of Europe. Near the Furka Pass, high in the Uri Alps, a tongue of ice descends from the peaks and ends abruptly at a wall of grey rock and gravel. This is the Rhône Glacier, and it is the source of one of the great rivers of Europe. The water that begins here, as meltwater dripping from the base of this retreating ice, will flow west through the canton of Valais, gather the flow of dozens of Alpine tributaries, pour into Lake Geneva at its eastern end, leave it again at Geneva itself, and continue on through France until it finally reaches the Mediterranean Sea. Hundreds of kilometers from where it started, as a single frozen drop. The Hotel Belvedere stood near the glacier's edge since 1882, and for most of its history, it looked directly out at a wall of ice. It no longer does. The glacier has retreated substantially within living memory, and each summer now, workers dig fresh access into a hollow beneath the remaining ice to create an ice cave for visitors. A cave that has to be recut nearly from scratch every year, because so much of the glacier that held the previous one has simply melted away. It is not the only river Switzerland gives away like this. The Rhine begins in Graubünden and eventually reaches the North Sea in the Netherlands. The Inn, running through the Engadine past Sils and Maloja, flows on into the Danube and finally the Black Sea. The Ticino flows south into the Po and out into the Adriatic. 4 separate seas on 4 separate edges of the continent, all fed by water that started as snow falling on the same relatively small cluster of mountains. That is why hydrologists have a name for this country that has nothing to do with banking or chocolate or watches. They call it the Water Tower of Europe. Every major river system on the continent, in some form, begins here, in ice that took thousands of years to accumulate and is now disappearing within a single human lifetime. It is worth returning, standing at the edge of that shrinking glacier, to the question this whole country has spent 7 centuries answering. What do you do when the ground beneath you refuses to stay still? The Swiss answer was never to control the mountains completely. It was to build precisely enough and stubbornly enough to live alongside them anyway. A charter between 3 valleys became a nation. A cursed mountain became a railway. A waterfall too deep to see became a tourist route through the rock. A wall of ice too remote to matter became the origin point of half the drinking water in Western Europe. The ice is still melting. The rivers are still running. And somewhere above Lauterbrunnen, above Lucerne, above the vineyards of Lavaux, more snow is falling on the same peaks that have been feeding this country and this continent since long before anyone thought to draw a border around it at all.